Hi, I'm Dan McClure. I work for ThoughtWorks, international innovation and technology consultancy, and my job is to look at how to do big, complex innovation. And one of the big subjects that's been coming up of late is how this intersects with some of the other challenges going on in the humanitarian sector, such as the participation revolution. Big innovation and the participation revolution are actually deeply tied to one another. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that is and why the future of both are so deeply intertwined. We've already had a couple of big revolutions. We've had the technology revolution, which gave us mobile phones and all sorts of new tools for working with communities that were related to both the web and mobile technology. We've had an innovation revolution, which got us the techniques of lean startup, fast-moving pilots, and innovation labs. And these are basically, with each of these new revolutions, there was a history of big hope and ambition that we were going to do something great that would make a step change in the way aid could work. The participation revolution is the latest revolution to join this group. And the idea here is that we would be able to, through the engagement of local actors, communities, and people on the ground, actually get a better form of response, an aid that is more tailored to the real challenges of the local communities that the local communities are facing. Unfortunately, if we look at these revolutions, they often tend to start off with big hopes, but end up with small results. And that's kind of disappointing because they seem to offer such promise. And one of the reasons for this is because they're in reality much more difficult challenges than they seem on their surface. An innovator's view, for example, of the world was originally quite simple. They would have a capability on the left, a need on the right, somebody in the local context, and that they would create then a product or a solution that would meet that need. This is sort of the classic model that most lightweight pilots are built around. And it's very much focused on the idea that there's a little piece of technology or a little piece of something that could make a real difference and that things would suddenly be better. So if we could just do a better job in this center point, we would get massive change. This is what I call the magic puzzle piece model. And it basically assumes that if we take a new tech, mobile application or invention, and we insert it into the context, bang, we'll fill the gap and everything will be better. And there's a few cases where this is true, where all we really needed was one additional piece of technology to really make a big step change in things. So for example, if you imagine you're standing outside your house and you want to get inside your house, a key is a piece of technology that really, really makes a difference. But there's not a lot of challenges in the real world that are quite that simple. There's another version of this, which is about using technology to take the existing systems that we have and make them better, supercharge them, make them more efficient, optimizing the performance of the status quo. And unfortunately, this is often a lot like taking a broken system and putting in a bigger engine for it. You may recall back to the 1960s when Ralph Nader was championing auto safety. He talked about the Corvair, which was a car that had a really, really big engine, but not very good steering and controls. And as a result, it was unsafe at any speed. Unfortunately, a lot of the organizations and structures that we're trying to optimize and improve the performance of today are like the Corvair. They're unsafe or ineffective, even with new, more highly efficient technologies. So we've got the problems of the magic pieces, the optimizing an imperfect organization, and then we go and try to solve some of the big problems that are out there. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there really was a hope for substantial shift as a result of innovation. We had too many people who were affected by crisis, a growing need and a widening resource gap. So the hope was that innovation would come in and give us the foundational changes needed to move us away from continuing need. So we take that little puzzle piece, we slap it on one of the solutions, and then we expect things to get better. But they don't. The crisis continues. The foundations of the complex foundations of the issues remain. And so even as we replicate these small puzzle piece type solutions or the supercharging of existing organizations, we see the same fundamental problems continuing over time. Now that's really discouraging because we had hoped for more. We do have, though, the possibility of making bigger changes, but it requires us to look at the problem as a more complex problem. So let's imagine we have a fragile system in an ongoing crisis. There are missing actors and incomplete or imperfect connections. We could start changing the system itself, looking at the full complexity of the system, adding in new actors, improving the capacity of different pieces, until we end up with a sustainable system that is actually resilient and independent. This is very different than sticking a puzzle piece in. What we're doing now here is working with the weave of different actors, working with different dimensions of incentives, and making all the pieces work together better. This is a complex system innovation. And it is the type of thing that offers the promise of real systemic change. Now the question is, why does the participation revolution matter in this environment? And the answer is because participation affects the way you design a system. Now, that doesn't mean that every aspect of the participation revolution is central to this new form of complex innovation. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of ways that the participation revolution can be advanced without necessarily being hand and tied with this complex innovation work that we're talking about. At the most basic level, we can have external actors like NGOs informing the beneficiary community of what's going on, and then listening to their responses back. This is a simple matter of communication, and it's one of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to engaging participation. The more difficult challenge is to, after listening, actually let that input affect your action. And this means that we need to become more flexible in responses. Even more in granting more power to the community would be if the funding went directly to the local actors instead of through the NGOs. Now, this is actually one of the goals that came out of the grand bargain, is to improve the amount of funding, increase the amount of funding going to local actors. So now we have an entire network of activity that basically empowers the traditional aid structure to serve beneficiary communities with greater levels of participation. Let's talk about changing things now, though, and here's where complex innovation becomes in. What if we wanted to extend the network, bring in new local actors, people who hadn't been involved before, and use that ability to change the nature of the ecosystem itself? Now we're beginning to get into system changes. We could even work to transform the beneficiary community itself. So instead of simply saying we're going to bring new actors in to deliver traditional aid, now we're talking about actually changing the on-the-ground situation to improve resilience and reduce the need for aid over the long term. These are the types of complex changes that we're talking about when we're doing complex innovation. And perhaps the most powerful version of that would be for the beneficiary community to assume control and treat the external actors as a resource or a service. These systems innovation changes basically require the complexity of systems innovation, but also systems innovation requires the engagement of a complex local community. And so they go hand in hand as we talk about how to drive change. The way that I like to think about it is that the SDGs basically said we need to reduce the amount of traditional aid we give people and instead change to thinking about innovation as aid, change as aid. So it's the transformation of the context and the situation that makes a difference. And over time, we should see more transformation and less traditional aid. The community is not optional in this process. What we see is that there is a long journey that begins with a 360-degree view of the community, ends with an exit vision that basically shows how the complex system works, and then involves the continual adjustment and learning as you move from one system state to another. This particular diagram was an interesting intersection of aid thinking and innovation thinking. It originally appeared in Leslie Bourne and Jessica Alexander's OCHA report on leaving no one behind that came out of the work of the SDGs. And what you see is that they identified 5 key activities for working to make the SDGs work. What we found is that they were extremely easy to overlay on the classic systems innovation model. So we basically see everybody driving through the same type of thinking. We need to think at a systems level, we need to have a target system to go to, and we need to be evolving as we go along. For that type of work, we need the community involved. If you've got a small innovation, you can have a single need where everyone is similar and you have assumed acceptance if you build the right product. So this is sort of like if I'm going to create an iPhone app to do a particular activity, I can talk to the specific users who are going to do that job. If I do a good job of design, I can assume that they're going to adopt it. In contrast, with system transformation, we have many and varied needs existing side by side. The actors aren't all the same, that they're diverse, they have different needs, they have different capabilities, they have different incentives. And as a result, we need to design a system in which everybody finds rewards and incentives. That requires a lot more time and effort around engagement. So we need to have rich, ongoing engagement that allows for ambiguity and differences. Robin Mays, in her study of Red Cross workers that were particularly effective in the field, called Valuing What Works, pointed out that the best workers were the ones that took time to understand and deeply immerse themselves in the systems of their communities and use the community as the primary driver of change rather than dictating change from the outside. In this case, system change becomes much more a case of being mentored than directed from outside. And that's a very big shift from simply consulting with a community or informing a community about the kind of change that you're doing. One of the big keys with any kind of sustainable system change is that everybody in the chain needs to be rewarded for their actions. And they need to be rewarded in a form of coin that is meaningful to them. So if you're thinking about the women in a community versus the children versus the people who are shopkeepers who might be both, you need to determine what the incentives are that make each one of them willing to continue to participate in the solution. So it's not enough to simply create a product that does something. You've got to create a system that generates a diverse range of incentives. The phrase that I like to use is that everyone gets a pony. So when you walk into the room, even though you're trying to do lots of different things, you need to be able to point to everyone who you expect to act and determine how they are going to get a pony. That requires deep insight. So success of your systems innovation is very much tied around understanding who desires what and needs what in the community. Each stage of this change, this transformation from one form of system to another, must be viable. You don't get to go off and do the project in a back room and then walk out and go, ta-da, here's your new system. Systems changes are done in place. And as a result, you not only have to create one viable system, at each stage of change, there must be viability. So you need to figure out a way to begin to slide your way to the new complex system through thin slices of change that each produce a viable working solution that moves to the next. This is a much more difficult challenge than simply breaking up a problem into small pieces, because what you're really doing is you're saying, I'm going to create multiple futures, each one that leads me a little closer to where I want to go. How do you do that? Well, you need to negotiate a shifting journey where you're going to test, learn, and adjust as you go. You will need a guiding vision of the outcome and where you want to end up, but you don't treat that as a fixed specification. Rather, you adjust your way as you're going along, as you learn and implement new things. Who best knows how to navigate this journey? Well, you might guess, in many ways, it's the members of the community that you want to do more than simply inform, but you want them to actively help you navigate through these changes. If you take technology, you take the innovation revolution, you take the participation revolution, we actually have 3 revolutions that can work together. And I'm really excited about the possibility of the partnership across these 3 domains, because it's a partnership that can allow us to solve a much more complex problem, the problem of complex system transformation, than we've ever been able to do before. So here are the 7 paths to participation. What I would advocate is, while paths 1 through 4 are straightforward and low-hanging fruit, we should also be looking at steps 5, 6, and 7, because this is the place where deeper system transformation can occur. Thank you very much. I'm Dan McClure. Hope this was useful.